Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the two associated bills to amend the SkillsFuture Singapore SSG Agency and Skills Development Levy Acts are sensible efforts to improve regulatory oversight over SSG grantees and training providers, while simultaneously strengthening investigative powers available to the agency. As someone who had previously sought clarifications on lapses identified by the Auditor General's Office for SkillsFuture grants, I agree with the revisions embedded in these two acts that aim to plug gaps in the framework. Hence, I support both bills. My comments today will first focus, however, on offering some constructive critique on the stipulations in the respective bills, including the benefits, but also what I regard as minor shortcomings that remain. I will go on to ask a meta question, whether the proposed regulatory enhancements alone are sufficient to ensure that SSG is able to identify and ensure the training providers for our workers are the very best available. The proposed measures that lend greater agency to SSG to investigate potential abuses of SSG grants and additional authority to pursue external providers that engage in fraudulent or predatory practices are sound. Clause 12 of the bill embodies a type of clawback provision beyond fines per se. This distinction is important because channeling recovered monies toward funding operational costs, which I believe is what Clause 9 allows, may strike one as a pragmatic way to finance the agency tasked with oversight. But in my view, there's one downside from such an approach, which I hope SSG will guard against. Tying enforcement actions to funding can give rise to potentially perverse incentives towards zealous or overzealous over-regulation and possible abuse by state authorities. This has been the case with asset seizure and civil forfeiture laws in the United States, which, in the most egregious cases, have given rise to predatory police behavior, excessive punishments, and the erosion of due process. In August last year, I, along with others, had filed queries based on the AGO report about how identified overpayments would be recovered. Minister Chan's written response at the time was that, and I quote, lapses were primarily due to wrong declarations by the grant applicants and errors in manual processing of grants, end quote. This conveys the notion that there had not been much gaming of the system and that most disbursements were simply due to idiosyncratic human error. In an oral response to other members of this House, including my Workers' Party colleague Sylvia Lim, Ms. Gan went on to elaborate that the bulk of these errors had occurred, quote, prior to November 2020, when SSG's previous IT system had used a declaration-based approach, end quote. To provide yet more context, the AGO report itself had estimated overpayments of around 4.2 million over the course of 3 years. This is, to be fair, a comparatively small fraction of the between 670 to 870 million provided for the agency in its budget. This, of course, should be contrasted against reported cases of attempted fraud, which in one instance amounted to 40 million over 14 years. Taken together, however, one is left wondering if SSG misappropriations are the result of genuine errors, which are relatively small and probably a matter of the past, while of course no misappropriation of public monies should be deemed acceptable, one is led to wonder if the ministry currently regards the sort of abuses that the bill seeks to address as a chronic and worrisome issue, or if the safeguards introduced are more out of an abundance of caution and prudence. Relatedly, may I ask the ministry to elaborate on how it currently tracks such abuses? By this I mean how SSG goes beyond internal and external audits of grant disbursements per se, to how it goes about evaluating whether programs proposed by training providers meet not just their stated objectives, but contribute to a genuine, economically valuable skills acquisition, and how subpar performance may be assessed. For example, the new sections 57E and F introduced by the bill allow for the policing of false or misleading advertising. But what if there's collusion between a given provider and trainee or trainees, where the provider receives the funds, shares the proceeds with the trainees, and skips delivery of the training? What if the courses offered appear to be associated more with consumption, home decoration or flower arrangement or wine tasting, rather than evidently future relevant skills, which presumably is the purpose of the agency? I'll return to this second concern later in my speech. Clause 2 of the proposed amendments to the Skills Development Levy Act will align the definition of remuneration in Section 2 of the Act with that of wages defined in Section 2(1) of the CPF Act. The Ministry assures us that, in practice, employers are already doing so. The concern here is that were this realignment to come to pass, such wages then go on to become part of the earned income of SkillsFuture recipients. More specifically, I'm concerned if the changes proposed by Clause 2 will be limited to just the manner by which employers file SDL, or will the SDL amounts also be included into the total compensation for employees? If so, I can imagine how doing so may result in an unintended consequence of discouraging the use of SkillsFuture credits. Many government subsidy programs are pegged to total compensation, and if SkillsFuture credits become recognized as another component of this mix, this may unintentionally lead to workers to forego training to ensure that they fall below some income threshold that qualifies them for higher tiers of subsidy. For example, I had recently appealed for a resident who, having received an IT device allowance to assist with the transition to work-from-home arrangements, found herself inadvertently and unwillingly bumped into a higher income threshold, thereby qualifying for lower subsidies as a result. The last thing we want is for SkillsFuture, which is meant for investment in one's human capital, to become perceived as an undesirable component of total income. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in principle, the idea of allowing external trading providers for SkillsFuture, rather than limiting it to a small set of in-house expertise, allows trainers to access a wider set of options for their SkillsFuture needs. Providers, in turn, could focus on course content and delivery, rather than be pressed with identifying and locating students. This specialization can therefore improve the overall efficiency of the SkillsFuture ecosystem. However, for the system to work and operate well, it is key that the courses are adapted to the needs of both the future economy as well as those of firms seeking skilled workers. To best calibrate courses with the demand side, and hence mitigate the risks I mentioned earlier that courses become more a form of consumption rather than investment, the Ministry has stated that it will eliminate funding for non-certifiable courses that are less relevant to industry, beginning in 2025. Presumably, this means that SSG will have done its homework in being in conversation with employers to ensure that certified courses and competencies do indeed match the needs of industry. Mr. Chan has stated in the past that SSG will make efforts to encourage the development of skills in future-oriented sectors, such as the green, care, and digital economies. I agree with this forward-thinking approach. I will only add that the agency should not apply a blanket ban, but consider the context as each case may present itself. While my suggestion that flower arrangement or wine tasting could be regarded as forms of consumption and perhaps frivolous consumption, they could well become spin-offs into viable businesses. We do not wish to stamp out the entrepreneurial spirits that could launch the next edible arrangements or Corova. But at the same time, we should not neglect the other elements of the supply side. It's essential that the pool of external providers be kept as large as possible, even as the set of courses, eligible for funding, narrow. Hence, what's crucial to ensure that trainers are indeed qualified to deliver the courses that they offer, accreditation as a SkillsFuture provider should not conversely be too onerous, so as not to discourage otherwise legitimate trainers and courses from becoming part of that pool. Unfortunately, this has not been my impression of the manner by which SkillsFuture currently recognizes training providers. One example is how difficult it is for individual educators to qualify to become an approved training provider. And as members of this House are aware, I declare that I am, of course, myself an educator working at a private tertiary educational institution in Singapore. Training professionals are required to secure an Advanced Certificate of Learning and Practice, or the ACLP. The original ACLP program required almost 130 hours, while the 2.0 version still requires about 89 hours. The fee is a non-trivial 5,940, although I'll happily note that SSG is fully internally consistent and provides Singaporeans and PRs with generous subsidies, including 90% funding for mid-career Singaporeans. Now, even so, asking experienced educators, such as university professors or tertiary education instructors, to go through additional pedagogical training is a severe impediment to their involvement, not least given the extensive demands already on the time of such professionals who juggle a slate of existing teaching, research, and service commitments. The last thing we wish to do is to burden them with so-called busy work, which would diminish their incentives to participate as a training provider. But also, for a moment, imagine asking an academic from one of our world-class universities, which may be one of the subject matter experts in the world, to sit through months of classes just so that they may have the privilege of offering education to our continuing education students. In response to a parliamentary question I filed about this approach, Minister Chan indicated that, quote, adults with prior relevant experience can seek credit exemption if they have comparable TAE qualifications and can provide evidence of relevant practice and experience, end quote. But such exemptions tend to be based on other comparable adult education qualifications, and there's little indication on the Institute for Adult Learning site that experience alone, coupled with domain-specific expertise, which tends to be the case for many university professors, would itself be sufficient. Moreover, the revised ACLP 2.0 does not seem to offer any credit exemptions, perhaps due to its novelty and already truncated nature. University educators aren't the only ones constrained by the current setup. The scheme that allows for in-house training providers was wound down in October 2022, and in-house training will no longer be available from 2025 onward. I understand that only 10% of SSG-funded courses were previously performed in-house. Was this scheme cancelled then due to perceived lack of interest? If so, it would strike me as strange to wind down funding for in-house training based on this statistic alone, rather than seeking to promote further take-up, because there's evidence that such in-house training can be particularly effective. Finally, skilled practitioners may also receive short shrift as a SkillsFuture training provider. Member Raj Thomas had asked in this House about how apprenticeships would be accredited, and Minister Chan's response was that the Workforce Skills Qualification Framework, or WSQ, includes an assessment-only pathway and is available across more than 500 courses. Now, to be clear, this is wonderful, but it remains unclear the extent to which WSQ AOP is being utilized. Would the Minister be willing to share with this House how many skilled practitioners have already qualified under this pathway, and if the AOP is being envisioned on the as the basis of a more fully fledged national apprenticeship program? In addition, the assessment of the WSQ competency standard still comes across as extremely academic, and I'm fully aware of the irony of this observation coming from an actual academic. After all, while ensuring that minimum standards are surely necessary, do we want journeymen and master skillsmen to subject themselves to curriculum design and development or painstakingly document pedagogical objectives for each and every lesson rather than actually go about teaching the craft? Are we subjecting them to knowledge assessment questions that test whether they're able to recall, and this is from the actual literature, what 3 types of food contaminants are, or if they can list 4 unhygienic personal habits, to the detriment of chefs who genuinely possess the creativity and skills to helm Michelin star restaurants? The entire purpose of an apprenticeship scheme is to allow those who are less likely to excel in acquiring paper qualifications to demonstrate their abilities by doing rather than knowing. Hence, while there is certainly some value in having such pedagogical tools weaved in, continuity after staff turnover, ensuring coverage of critical concepts, I would go as far as to argue that these should be defined only at a very high level rather than preoccupy the time of otherwise erstwhile teachers. While these bills have been focused on the supply side, we also do need to pay some attention to fostering demand. This is, of course, the topic of another speech, but one common feedback we often hear is how we can reduce the opportunity costs of individuals who are concurrently working, rather than those who have already separated from a job, so that they also receive incentives to pursue such upgrading. What are the agency's plans to strengthen incentives for existing employers to encourage SkillsFuture credit use if it's revealed to them that their employees are indeed underutilizing them? The Deputy Speaker, we truly want to build a future-proofed workforce. We need to ensure that the training we are providing them are fit for purpose. These bills before the House today are important, common-sense steps to improve the functioning of the system. And for that reason, they have my support. But I'm hopeful that even as we tighten the regulatory constraints to eliminate fraud and abuse of the system, we will also explore ways to reduce the hurdle rate placed on legitimate trading providers to ensure that the skills imparted on our trainees and mid-career switchers are indeed the best available ones for the future.